UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, we've got Fert Derby and Lord Uther. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, welcome. We are cracking back into season three, which is quickly winding down for us in Star Trek's original series run. And today we've got a very interesting episode starring only two guest stars and a recurring prop guest star, which is exciting. But I don't want to take anything away from Fert Derby here. Take us into the background of Requiem for Methuselah.
Thank you, Urza. Thank you, Uther. Thank you, Warp Core fans who continue to deliver week after week, even when sometimes Star Trek fails to clear that bar. We are indeed Requiem for Methuselah. This was the Valentine's Day episode in 1969, February 14th. We have a new director, Murray Golden. Murray, again, like many TV journeymen of the era, spent his time just jumping from show to show, set to set. He worked on The Fugitive, Bonanza, Trapper John M.D., Rawhide, and Adam West's Batman, to name but a few. And he got a shot here doing a Star Trek episode and probably picked up a sweet paycheck. Our writer was Jerome Bixby, and we've seen Jerome's work before here on the Warp Core podcast, and so have our loyal viewers. He made his debut with Mirror Mirror, which we've talked about extensively on Warp Core 45. Check out the archives. A pivotal, foundational Star Trek episode if there ever was one. He also worked on By Any Other Name, which we covered in Warp Core 61, and Day of the Dove, which we covered in Warp Core 72. So that would make this Jerome's fourth scripted addition to the original series. And we also had, as UrzaMaster suggested, two prominent cast members in basically a locked room kind of sets. They mostly spent time with interiors, keeping that budget as low as they can possibly go. Playing Reyna, whom we'll get into her background and so forth, was Luis Sorel. And playing Flint, our man Flint, was James Daly. James Daly, who it turns out was the father of several children, two of whom became actors and actresses. You might remember Tyne Daly. She played Clint Eastwood's partner in one of the Dirty Harry sequels. I want to say it might have been The Enforcer in 1976. She was also one half of the noted crime duo Cagney and Lacey, although all of you Warp Core fans and pending rebrand fans, you can Google to see which one she actually played, Cagney or Lacey. And Tim Daly, whom I've always enjoyed from a Stephen King miniseries in the late 90s, Storm of the Century. He got to play the lead in an ABC adaptation of an original Stephen King property, but you might remember him as the charming sitcom lead of Wings from NBC's Must See TV. So Tyne and Tim are related because they are the offspring of James. And a little bit of tragedy, well, at least as far as families go, with the Dalys. According to Tim, his son, James came out to him 10 years after he left his wife, Tim's mother. And this was in the 70s, back when coming out suggested there was something inferior with your brain or your chemistry, your biological impulses, what have you. And he unsuccessfully tried to get treatment for it, and it failed. And as a result, he cut off contact with his family for fear that he might, quote, infect them with his sickness. Now, we're sitting here in 2024, heading into 2025, and obviously our knowledge of homosexuality and the LGBTQ community and so forth has greatly expanded since the 1970s. But it did cause a lot of family pressure for James, and there was, years lost based on these misconceptions and so forth. So that was kind of a sad note when doing the research there. Gentlemen, I may be catching a case of Rigelian fever, and if so, this is the most you'll see on camera. This was absolutely like the most benign plague I've seen sweeping a starship crew. We heard about it a lot, but we didn't actually ever see anybody in sick bay with a thermometer under their tongue or anybody being treated for it. In fact, when we cut to the Enterprise for a few brief moments, Scotty and Uhura looked pleasantly just as they were. But yes, Rigelian fever is sweeping through the Enterprise, and they need the ingredients to make a cure. That leads them to a planet of which there appears to be only a couple of inhabitants, and a setup right out of Shakespeare's The Tempest, or Forbidden Planet, which was a rare Leslie Nielsen science fiction drama from 1956. Go ahead and Google that one. You will not be disappointed. But we also had some Flash Gordon 1980 special effects, and Ursa will mention our favorite return of one of those effects. We had more billiards. Star Trek loves to work in some billiards, a piece of the action. Someone had a pool table, in somebody's office and said, "Hey, drag that in there. We can use that." Spock played a vibrant and robust waltz during this episode. And if you've ever wanted to see Leonardo da Vinci and Johann Brahms, who it turns out are the same person, beat the ever-living tar out of James Tiberius Kirk, well, this is your episode, because that's pretty much what happens in the third act. If you stop and think about it, it does sound a little silly. Da Vinci's got the upper hand on our fearless Starfleet captain, but no, that's actually what happens, and it's very interesting. Gentlemen, this episode, it's again not reinventing wheels. We have beings that seemingly, have all the answers or great knowledge or can outthink our crew. And it's the mystery as to what they're hiding, what's behind door number 3. And so when we discover it, it takes us into some interesting places for first season Trek, places that we end up probably exploring in later iterations of the show. What did we think of Johann Brahms and Leonardo da Vinci's ultimate master plan?
It was interesting, and it opens up a lot of questions for later Trek too. But to just kind of contain it to this episode and original series, it's not something we haven't seen flashes of in prior episodes. The idea of sort of an immortal Earth person who has all this knowledge and all of these artifacts, and the hoodwink here is almost just a matter of convenience. Like, oh, we need this mineral to make this inoculation, and why they couldn't synthesize it or why they couldn't get it elsewhere, why it had to be this planet. And it just so happens, this Methuselah has been here this whole time. And then there's the whole love trap thing. It's like, oh, I have to make sure she can love, so I have to make sure Kirk falls in love with her. Like, it almost feels like they put all of the tropes of Star Trek's original series run into a blender and, hit puree, and then whatever they poured out onto the page is what we get. That being said, it works really well. I mean, it's funny. It's Spock being enamored with like all this rare art that's like, this is, I mean, I think at one point he even says he's like beside himself with jealousy because there's all this never before seen art from these famous artists, and of course speaks to his Vulcan proclivities and this sort of lust for logic in a way, which I think art captures. Why the obfuscation though? That's the one thing. Like, why is he hiding all of this? Like, why can't like the Q famously don't hide the fact that they've been around and they know everything. This person, is basically the Wolverine and feels the need to hide it, but longs for companionship. And it's like, geez, you know, you could be somebody of some vast importance if you just weren't such an isolationist. And I think that's something that's, you know, kind of an odd question about Star Trek as a whole, because we think, you know, we see this in a few different episodes across all of the different series, where these folks who collect these rare things, you know, like the Collectors Guild, as we see in many episodes, including Lower Decks and Next Generation, you know, they have all this rare stuff. But they're very like private. Although the Collector in Next Gen is like bringing people and hosting people and trying to show off. Um, but you know, they're very much solitary folks. They don't get involved. But this is a person who longs for love. They've had many wives before. They've came and gone, and part of me is like, I mean, is it the human element that makes this what it is? Is it that, you know, they needed something for the audience to identify with, so they made it more human and like, you know, I need to create the perfect companion. I need to make sure that this companion is capable of these things. And then of course there's the idea of like, if you're a permanent being, the only way you can surround yourself with beings that you can interact with permanently are robots. And you know, we get our favorite non sequitur prop back, floating around, you know, in very menacing way. I do like the hoodwink of the episode. You think it's going to be, you know, this little M5 floating around being somehow the villain, you know, the puritanical robot, you know, trying to keep Kirk from getting the girl, and then it kind of flips to you. And I think that's what I enjoyed most about this. Is it really? I mean, I knew where it was going because I'd seen it before, but you know, to untrained eyes, and certainly of the time, it really takes you in a great misdirection. Like, you really don't know, is there even villainry going on here? And by the end of the episode, is there villainry, or is this just a happenstance of, you know, a scientist doing an experiment to try and make the perfect lover, and or perfect partner for an immortal being? The one thing I thought was a little unsuccessful is at the end they're kind of like, oh, and now he's mortal, and it's like, what? Like what? Why? Like that seemed like it was kind of thrown in. Like, why not just be like, well, we'll make sure to tell Starfleet not to come back here so he can live his, you know, immortal existence with his robot girlfriend, um, which seems perfectly reasonable. I mean, it's not like he was violent or, you know, enslaving Orion girls for his amusement or anything. It's just a little odd. But maybe it was just to, I don't know, add more of a human element to the episode. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear what you guys think about it, but I enjoyed myself. I'm not trying to tear this episode apart or anything. It was a great episode, but that last little tidbit, I was like, why?
Yeah, so I looked at this episode a little differently, I guess. And I even messaged you guys saying, like, I felt like this was the total setup for Data. That you know, that question of just androids in general, right? Like, you really couldn't tell she was an android until we get a little deeper into the episode. So I just felt like, even though this wasn't their intention back then, it obviously sets up what we wind up seeing in Next Gen. But the one thing that really stuck out was at the end, and this is what's going to boost my Warp Core score extremely high. Actually, let me back up for a second. I thought at some point they were going to have all three of them, have the big three, falling in love with the android, and there might have been some kind of competition. I kind of wouldn't mind seeing that, because I felt like that's where it was set up for at first. I think that just would have been an interesting spin. But anyway, at the end, we have McCoy walking out of Kirk's living quarters, and Kirk is asleep, but very upset about the android. And then Spock leans down, does a mind meld, and says, forget. And here's why I love this. Because what's he going to say in Wrath of Khan? Remember. So going from forget to remember and just letting that spin around in my head. I'm like, ah. Oh. Now I don't. Again, is it intentional in Wrath of Khan that he says remember? Was there any? Probably not, right? There's probably no link back to this episode, but I do kind of like when those things happen that you end this episode with forget, and then you have that piece where he wants someone to remember. So just an interesting little thing that's kind of probably thrown into the episode, which, looking back on it retrospectively, has a pretty big impact that he could do something like that. So I really like this episode. I thought it was going to be a stinker, and it wound up for me being a nice, solid sci-fi episode again.
Maybe we should knock on wood, gentlemen, because as we've said, following some initial, real ups and real downs, Plato's stepchildren, I'm looking at you, it feels like season 3 has kind of settled, if not, again, reaching those foundational heights of the first 2 seasons. It's at least now, again, comfortable telling the stories it wants to tell, and doing so in a way that doesn't feel haphazard, slipshod, like, oh, they're just taking the paycheck and running. So it becomes all the more shame when you realize that we've only got, after Requiem for Methuselah, 5 episodes left. Again, you just feel like, okay, so they've kind of regained their equilibrium. They're not taking on water. They found a way to make this work with some of the limitations that have been imposed upon them. They know their characters inside and out. Like, would a season or 2 more, have even deepened the lore, or is part of Trek's legend and mythology and mythos was that it was sort of cut down a little too soon, which allowed for it to arise like a phoenix, with the animated series and the big screen franchise, and then the relaunching of television, and then the creation of entire television networks just to highlight Star Trek content. Let's not forget that United Paramount Network was created, launched with Star Trek Voyager and Deep Space Nine and so forth, later seasons of DS9. So yeah, it's bittersweet, because we know that they're going to run hard into the Great Barrier here. And now, again, only 5 more to go, Warp Core fans, so stay tuned. But it feels like, again, knock on wood, it feels like they've kind of found a healthy balance now. Again, these might not be transcendent Trek, but they almost certainly are. Yeah, that's a good way to pass, time on a Friday night.
Yeah. And it's interesting, to say the least, that, we've run into this situation with Trek this deep into season 3. So suffice to say that it's going to be an interesting journey in the last few episodes here, but we have to give this one a Warp Core rating, and again, I urge us not to look through the lens of just season 3, because we've had some low lows. We're inching towards some high highs, but not the highest highs of the series. Let's start this week with Fert Derby. How do you rate, on a scale of 7 Warp Cores, Requiem for Methuselah?
I think based on Nimoy's performance, which, especially as Uther points out, that poignant final moment, as well as when he tries to stop Kirk from discovering the secrets of Reyna, and he's like, let me go in, and Kirk's like, we'll all go in, and then discovers that. I think Spock once again is a solid anchor. I think, again, intellectually, I think this works as Trek. I'd give it a fistful. I'd say it's a solid 5.
I'm gonna go 6.1, just because the whole thing with forget totally, they had me at forget. So for me, I've broken the 6.5s. I'm going 6.1 on this episode. Gives me slight hope for the last few episodes.
Love it. I'm also going with the 6 rating, solid 6. I really enjoyed this episode a lot. There were a few little tiny things, but that has always been the hallmark of a great episode where I hang on something like, and now he's mortal. What? But yes, the construction of the episode, the acting was superb. Despite some of the backstory here that's a little on the darker side, this was a pretty good shining light in season 6, and I think stands with many of the best episodes of Star Trek: The Original Series. It's probably just outside, just shy of my must-watch Star Trek episode list. But it would probably be a quick mention of like, oh, and if you have time, Requiem for Methuselah. So, finally, we're seeing a good streak here in late season 3 with 5 episodes to go. I remain hopeful. I do tend to agree that I think some of these episodes are probably what sets up the infamy that Star Trek enjoys after its cancellation. But, gentlemen, until we get back on that 5-year, 3-year mission, I must urge all of you out at Pending Rebrand to make sure to like, subscribe, and share, and live long and prosper.